Today's episode is powered by Listen, a groundbreaking AI platform transforming how child welfare and other public sector providers learn and grow. Imagine being able to roll out comprehensive, secure training and quality monitoring across your entire organization instantly. That's exactly what Listen delivers to over 70 public and private sector clients. Developed by PhD academic psychologists, Listen helps health and human services agencies master motivational interviewing and other evidence-based practices. And this isn't just another training tool. It's backed by 16 years of rigorous research and peer-reviewed studies. To learn more, visit listen.io. That's lyssn.io. lyssn.io. Or follow the link in the show notes.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on all social media. On today's episode, which is episode 201, we're on the path to 300 already. We are joined by Amy Harfeld, National Policy Director for the Children's Advocacy Institute, to talk about the ways in which child welfare systems are using the Social Security benefits owed to foster youth. While it is technically legal for systems to be the recipient of this money on behalf of kids in its care, Harfeld has been among the staunchest advocates raising attention to the fact that they are, in many cases, simply offsetting their costs with that money and not saving it for kids or using it for their unique needs. This is a topic that the Imprint has reported on quite a bit over the years, so I'm going to include our links in the show note. I'll also link to the major investigation by NPR and the Marshall Project from several years back that brought a lot of mainstream attention to this issue. My conversation with Harfeld here is a fairly long interview, so here's my recommendation. The first about 23 minutes we spend talking really just about the issue itself, how this came to happen, that child welfare agencies became a primary recipient of SSI benefits, as they're called, for youth that are in the foster care system. We talked about Amy's first experience with a client having their benefits captured by a system. In this case, it was New York City. So the first 23 minutes or so is really a primer on the topic. The rest of the time, we spend talking about what actions states have already taken, because dozens of states have started to act and legislate around this. We talked about what, in her view, are the fundamentals of really good state and federal action. And we talked about what makes her optimistic that we will see the end of this practice in the near future. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Amy Harfeld. In 2022, an investigation by the Marshall Project and NPR exposed a practice that many close to the child welfare system knew had been happening for decades. State and county systems tapping into the survivor and disability benefits managed through the Social Security Office owed to youth in foster care, not to pay for anything unique to the child, but to cover the general cost of them being in foster care. Little has changed from a federal policy standpoint since then, but there's been quite a bit of action on the local and state level as pressure mounts to protect these benefits, which could be tremendous use to a foster youth, either during their time in care or afterwards. Here to help us break this all down, where things stand, what good federal policy or legislation might look like on this subject, is Amy Harfeld, National Policy Director for the Children's Advocacy Institute, who has really tirelessly advocated for better protection of these benefits for a very long time. So Amy, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Before we get into this weighty subject, like always, you got to tell these folks listening a little something about yourself. So you got to give them a favorite in one of these categories and give them more if you want. Movie, TV show, musical group, book, or sports team? Amy Harfeld, what do you have for the people?
All right. Well, I know it might, not be very novel, but my favorite book that I've read in the last number of years is Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, which inspired me to the point where I went back and picked up my grandmother's original copy of David Copperfield, which I'd actually never read. And so it was a cool story and also a really, I think, novel literary accomplishment.
Right on. Yeah, I get some that book prompted a lot of feelings for a lot of people. I think we had a couple of young people write about it in different ways, like what their perspective was on it.
Well,
I think
if
that's it.
you read it carefully, you'll notice she mentioned the Social Security benefits of kids a couple
Right,
times.
right. So let's get right into that then. I want to make sure people really understand the what here before we get into, a fairly complicated corner of child welfare policy. Why don't you walk people through sort of how a youth in foster care might be eligible for these Social Security managed benefits, who typically receives them when a child isn't in the system, right? So, like, same kid, but they're not in the foster care system. Well, how does that go down? And then just how child welfare agencies come to become these recipients.
Yeah. So we all know what Social Security is to the extent that it affects everyone, right? We all pay taxes into our Social Security accounts, which are intended to be a forced retirement savings plan so that when we retire we have some income to support ourselves, and if we should pass away before we retire, that money goes to a surviving spouse or to a child to make sure that that child's needs are met until they are an adult. So that is Social Security benefits that we know because we've paid into it ever since we got our first paycheck. Another kind of Social Security is called a Title II disability insurance. And Social Security survivors or retirement is a paid investment that is our own income, our own dollars that we invest in our retirement account. SSI or disability is a federal entitlement program. So those are the two kinds of Social Security that children usually find themselves eligible for. Now, in terms of SSI, disability, and I use those terms interchangeably, a child could be eligible because they have a physical or mental disability that qualifies under the rules, or they could have come from a household with a parent with a disability where the benefits would go to the child. So the standards for disability are different for a child and for an adult. So for older foster children, they would have to requalify for benefits if they're approaching the age of 18. But in terms of Social Security, those are the two different types of benefits that foster children may be eligible for when they enter care or during the time that they're in care.
Okay, got it. Let's take a situation where a child was eligible for SSI benefits of some kinds in one of the categories you just described, but they weren't in foster care. Who is, I
Yeah,
mean, obviously this is going to range, I'm guessing, based on their age, but like, let's say for like a 7-year old who clearly we're not going to ask
right,
them to manage their own money, who is usually
right.
the payee on that, right? If it's not in foster care.
Correct. So, I mean, under most of our system in the US, children are not allowed to have accounts titled in their name unless they're not a minor. So, for children's benefits, generally speaking, there has to be an adult who receives the money on their behalf if there's some benefit. And this is a really important question because, generally speaking, I don't think anybody would argue that Social Security disability benefits are intended to meet the disabled person's basic needs and to help support them to make sure that they have sufficient stability in their lives to receive the treatment they need to address their disability. So they might need services that the family can't afford. It might be that the family really just needs the money to make sure that they can maintain a stable household, get their rent paid, get their bills paid, get their child to their appointments, and sometimes to equip the home with the right things to make it accessible for the child. So generally speaking, when disability money comes in, it is intended to meet a child's basic needs. And that's what happens when a child lives at home. The money comes into the household, and the family uses it to make sure that there is housing stability, food stability, that the lights stay on. And because the parent has that money to create the stability in the home, it elevates the standard of living of that child, of the beneficiary. It also elevates the economic stability of everybody in the household. But very importantly, the benefit is in the child's name. And so I think everybody can understand the notion that a benefit in a person's name should end up with some benefit to that person.
Sure.
So a child living at home, which is what most cases are, benefits by having the money go to their family and having that increased level of economic stability to keep the family together and get that child's needs met.
Right. So now we'll go to the situation of a child who's in foster care, living to some extent in the custody of the state. How would a child welfare agency come to become the payee instead of, a relative or a parent that
Yeah.
the child is living with?
Well, I mean, the way I want to answer that question, John, is just to go back to who pays for foster care in general, right? Because legally, there is no distinction between how foster care gets paid for under federal law for a kid, whether or not they have benefits. So, the legal framework that determines what happens with foster care is a combination of state and federal law. And because all states receive federal dollars in one way or another, there are sort of federal floors that folks have to follow. So every state that receives Title IV-E money understands that Title IV-E directly says in the statute that when a state removes a child from their home and places them in foster care, the state must pay the cost of maintenance for that child. It's unequivocal. Every state also has a statute that mirrors that requirement to some extent. So foster care is generally, child welfare is a state-run program, and each state has their own ways of doing things, but all of them need to follow the rules of 4E just at the outset. And that makes sense, right? If the government is going to take such a draconian step to come into a family's home and life and separate a child from their parents, they are taking the child away from the economic supports that they had. They're taking them away from the person who is housing them and feeding them and clothing them. And they then take on the responsibility to care for that child while they are away from their family. So it's, partly just common sense. So I just sort of want to start there. Foster care is required to be paid by the state or county agency when a child is removed. If the child is eligible for 4E reimbursement, depending on what the state is and what their rate is, then the state might get reimbursed half of the maintenance cost for the child's foster care. So generally speaking, that's where we are, right? That's how child welfare gets financed. The state pays for most of the services, and Title IV-E, in addition to some other federal sources, which are, a little bit smaller and possibly shrinking, helps them to cover some of those costs and then to reimburse the costs for other things like administrative services and legal representation, et cetera. So that is the funding structure for child welfare. And the simplest way to put it is it really isn't any different for these kids. So the federal laws that govern how child welfare gets financed, they actually don't say that the agency has to pay for the foster care of every child except the disabled kids. Because of course that wouldn't make any sense, and that would sort of obviously lead to allegations of violating the equal protection rights of these children.
Indeed.
But in practice, that is what we see happening. So I just sort of want to lay that big picture out, generally speaking, because what's happening to kids who are getting benefits was never meant to be part of the child welfare funding scheme. And I use this scheme here because, there's sort of an innocuous way of using it and a more insidious way of using it. And this really was a scheme to go after children's money.
I want to get a little more into that in a
Yeah.
minute, but just before we move on to that, because I think, that's what this deep investigation kind of surfaced and what you've been talking about for even longer than that. And we've covered a little bit in terms of just procedurally. I think there might be people wondering, how would a child welfare agency even become the payer,
Right.
right? So how
Right.
does that
So
work?
so that's like the big picture of how it gets
Yeah,
paid for. Then what is it that happens that makes right now it's about, 5 to 10% of children eligible for benefits while they're in foster care.
right.
So that's a good question. There are some kids who actually come into care with benefits already in place. Starting in the late 80s to mid 90s, a practice evolved from what we have seen happen several times when big federal programs that provide basic economic supports to families are reduced or cut. Oftentimes those same cuts will be experienced by child welfare agencies, so their own budgets are cut when other programs are cut and when the economy is not in a good place, and that leaves agencies in a place where they have to figure out how they pay for the services that they provide, which, as a former agency attorney myself in New York City, I sympathize with and understand that it's a very real challenge that needs to be addressed. When state cuts happened in the late 80s, early 90s, there were big consulting companies who were hired to develop sort of strategies on how to overcome those problems and how to make these agencies solvent. For example, one of those groups was called Maximus, which is a large private for profit data mining company, essentially. And they developed what I will again call a scheme called revenue maximization. And they said child welfare agencies should operate from a revenue maximization point of view. And there is a professor, Dan Hatcher at University of Baltimore School of Law, who's also sort of the leading academic on this and one of the folks who really uncovered this in the first place. He, through some FOIA requests, actually got one of the Maximus reports that literally refers to foster children as revenue generating mechanisms, which should horrify anyone listening to this. That is how this practice started. They started out of desperation. They started looking for, by any means necessary, to pay for services, even if it meant charging and harming the very children they were supposedly intervening to help. That's how this started. They started to look at unique funding streams that didn't explicitly prohibit certain uses of the money. And so they intentionally went into those somewhat loosey grayish areas to see what they could get away with. Not out of some malicious intent, out of financial desperation. So they went after not only children's benefits, they've also gone after veterans' benefits that children receive if their parents died while in active duty or had been honorably discharged from former military service. There are some states that go after the private assets of foster children or other smaller programs like Railroad Benefits Fund or Black Lung Disease Fund. These were all sort of different states adopted different things that they were going to go after.
And also child support
And
payments, which are pegged to a child.
well, that's what I was
You know?
going to say.
Yeah.
And then they decided to go after the parents themselves, not all the parents, only the poorest parents of the 4E children who went back home. Those parents, after their kids were sent home, were sent child support bills in lots of places, and they still are in
Yeah.
some places, although the feds have discouraged it and encouraged them to stop. So all of a sudden, these families, many of whom we know, end up in the child welfare system because of instability in the home and economic issues. We are then creating additional economic instability in these families that is an unnecessary extra burden to creating successful and expedient returns home, reunifications home, to helping those reunifications stick, and sometimes potentially preventing that child from entering the system in the first place. So that is sort of how it started, out of financial desperation to pay for services, and nobody was paying attention. It really wasn't a policy that was well publicized. It wasn't actively debated. And there initially were not the sort of outrage and uproar that you would think about it, because it was happening so quietly. And because disabled foster children are really rather vulnerable, how would they know that this was happening? How would their parents know this was happening? How would their attorneys know this was happening? Really, nobody in the case was ever informed as a matter of policy or procedure that this was something that was happening. So
And I
that's
think
how
that
it
that's
started.
the key point here. I think to know is, as you mentioned, there are certainly kids who come into foster care already eligible for these benefits, right? Like their parent could have passed away before they enter foster care, and so they would have been a recipient
Right. That's
already.
the reason some young people
But
end up in foster care,
right,
right?
sure, but the majority, I think it's safe to say, who are in foster care with these benefits, it is the actual practice, per what you were just describing, of these agencies to see who might get these benefits, enroll them,
Right.
and become the payer themselves.
Exactly. So, this policy that opened up at that point in time, it was always intended not to help children who have extra needs, but it was always really based in trying to get more money for states to pay for foster care. It was never really seen as a way to better address the needs of youth, which is, unfortunate
Yeah.
and is changing, I think.
Do you recall the first time you became aware of this practice? Like, how did you
Oh,
come to know about this?
yeah, I remember exactly the moment I became aware of it. And it's, haunted me my entire career, to the point where I just refused to give up this fight. So during, my early days as a lawyer in dependency proceedings, I was at legal aid assisting with some cases with older youth. And there was a young woman, Jasmine, who was 17 and had, was simply wanted to emancipate from care a year early. And she was a really impressive young woman, very accomplished, and had already been accepted to Hunter College. She had graduating from high school, she had college plans, and the housing from the school was going to be her housing plan. So not only had she sort of lined everything up for her early transition, so everything seemed like it was going smoothly, until she called me one day and said, "Miss Harfeld, I just went to the bank to withdraw my tuition deposit for Hunter College. And the bank manager told me that I only have $2,000 in there, and that the other $11,000 was frozen by the state of New York." And I sort of, did a quizzical look and said, "What do you mean? That doesn't make any sense." And she said, "Well, all I can tell you is my tuition deposit's due in about 10 days, and I need to get this sorted out." So then I went, on the hunt to figure out what was going on. And as a former ACS attorney in New York, I had some good connections with staff there, and ended up speaking to somebody in the finance office who explained to me how this works. That, children are automatically screened when they enter foster care for a variety of different benefits that the agency would like to use to pay for the child's care. And when Jasmine entered care, they found her to be eligible for survivor benefits, because her mom, a single mom, had been a healthcare worker and paid into the system for all her working years, and then died, leaving a 14-year-old. So she had these survivor's benefits that she was eligible for. And she also entered care with severe PTSD after losing her mom in her arms at the age of 14, which we can also understand, which made her eligible for SSI at that time. The agency applied for SSI and for survivor benefits on behalf of Jasmine without ever telling her, or me, or any of the members of her legal team or her family. They applied for these benefits, and when they were approved, the question was, well, who should get the checks? Now, the agencies have pretty consistently misinterpreted what the Social Security Administration requires in terms of who should serve as the beneficiary. And SSA has turned a blind eye for decades now. So, what is supposed to happen with those checks once they're approved is they're supposed to go to an individual that has personal relationship with the child, that cares about the child and their future, and that's, that you can trust. Oftentimes that can be a parent. If there has been no TPR, Social Security Administration is very clear that it's totally appropriate for the parent to serve as the representative payee to deposit those checks. If it's not the parent, it could be a family member, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a family friend, fictive kin. Really, the goal of SSA is any individual that has a caring personal relationship with that child is going to look out for them is preferable to an organizational representative payee. Yet, because the rule says the first preference is a parent or legal guardian, and in some states, the state agency is deemed the legal guardian once the child is placed in care, they have decided that they are the ones who should serve as the first option as the representative payee. And to date, they haven't really been corrected in the way that they should be. So it's sort of a, linguistic glitch or oversight that they claim that they're entitled to receive these benefits. And frankly, they've just been allowed to keep doing it since this practice happened. So that's how the checks end up coming to the state. Federal rules require that the money with a child's name on it be placed in an individual account for the child and, accounted for on a regular basis. But frankly, in most states, the money ends up in a general fund for the state. It doesn't directly align with the price of that child's care. It doesn't even end up in child welfare accounts in many states. It ends up literally in state general revenue funds without a direct tie or accountability back to the actual cost of the actual benefits received and the child's cost of care.
So if I could try to sum that up in layman's terms and check me if I miss anything here, setting aside whether or not the child welfare agency would be the appropriate recipient anyway, to the extent they are, the expectation really should be that if they're getting money for an individual child because of their disability or because of something that happened with their parents, that money either should really be saved for them or it should be spent on them in a way that is very specific to something they need, not just for paying for the cost of them being in foster care. Is that about right?
That's about right. The fact of whether the child is eligible for or receiving benefits has nothing to do with how their foster care gets paid.
Right.
If a child is eligible for survivor or disability benefits, what it means is that in relative terms to the other kids in care, they are facing additional obstacles and barriers that will impact them long term in terms of their outcomes and their futures. So, would we like, ideally, for all kids in care to have money set aside for them, to have sort of a universal account that's available to all youth who age out? Yeah, of course. That's where I hope things go one day. Right now, there are a small group of foster youth who are facing these additional challenges and are eligible for these benefits. Those benefits are meant for them. And the word benefit really is all we need to know, right? A benefit is intended to be used to serve the individual best interests of that particular child. And you should be able to point to what is it that they got that was extra, right? How did they benefit from their benefits? And in the instance where a child's entire check is sucked up and spit out into a general state account, in the words of Ian Marks, who's a former foster youth from Louisiana, who's written and helped with a variety of different trainings, he said, I didn't get any better foster care than my foster care peers because I was receiving benefits. I got the same lousy foster care that they got. The only difference was I was the sucker who got stuck with the bill.
Caseworkers are stretched thin, balancing high caseloads and endless paperwork. But with SpeakRight, documentation doesn't have to mean burnout. SpeakRight's Protective Services transcription cuts paperwork time dramatically, so you can meet deadlines, reduce overtime, and focus on what truly matters, the families you serve. With SpeakRight's free mobile app and desktop platform, caseworkers can capture detailed narratives anytime, anywhere, with just one tap to upload. SpeakRight is proven to lower stress and turnover, helping agencies retain dedicated staff while improving case quality. Don't let documentation slow you down. Let SpeakRight do the heavy lifting. Visit speakright.com/imprint to see how SpeakRight can transform your agency today. That's SpeakRight, SpeakWrite.com/imprint.
So there's really two, entities, three, I guess, that could make a difference here and sort of reorient the use of these benefits back towards the individual children who are entitled to them. I say three because I guess I would say the executive branch of the federal government is one, the Social Security Agency, the administration in power, well, whoever that is at the time, Congress can get involved, and then let's say state government as the third. So I want to kind of go backwards because actually a lot.
We have to put in the fourth.
Who's the fourth?
The courts.
The courts. Okay, fair enough. I think it's safe to say there has not been a lot of federal action on this. And I want to ask you later what good federal policy making or legislation would look like. But I want to start with the states because there actually has been quite a bit of action there. But I'm hoping that you might be able to just sort of break down for listeners sort of what buckets that's sort of been sorted into. Because my conversations with you, I would say in summary, there's been a lot of attempted legislation. There's been quite a bit that's passed, some of which has very thoroughly regulated here, and some that has sort of scratched a little bit at the surface, right? So can
That's
you
fair.
describe for listeners like what like maybe give a few examples of, or at least one example of like a very strong piece of legislation that's done this, and so who's done it the best? I mean, what's the best piece of state legislation, and explain to people what it did?
So at the moment, and we're in April 2025, there are 6 states or jurisdictions that have actually ended the practice entirely. I say jurisdictions because DC is one of them, and we're still trying for statehood.
But I want to be clear, what does it mean to end the practice? When you say what is the practice? Yeah.
Okay. What ending the practice means is acknowledging that this is the personal property of the child, that the state has legal and ethical obligations under federal law and state law often to pay for the child's care, that when the state does serve as representative payee for the child's benefits, they have very specific fiduciary duties when they are serving in that role, and they need to follow those rules. The most important, piece of these laws is you're not allowed to take the kid's money for yourself. You actually have to use the child's benefits the way that federal law and Social Security intended. And if you look at the Social Security rules that really go into detail about what this practice means in different circumstances, what they say is, as we've already discussed, children's benefits, generally speaking, are intended to meet their basic needs. However, if a child's basic needs are met by another method or means or source of income, then the child's benefits must be conserved for their future needs or spent for additional unmet needs while they're in care. Now, they have not yet specified that they mean foster care there, but that should be fairly easy to do because that's, what all the states have concluded. So a strong bill, really at the state or federal level, does 5 things. It requires the states to screen kids for benefits and apply for benefits on their behalf. This is their obligation as the legal parent of a child who they've removed from their home. They're obligated to meet that child's needs. And if that child has income that they're owed, they're serving in the role as parent and they need to be responsible stewards of that money. So we have to make sure to memorialize the obligation to screen and apply for benefits. The second is they have to provide fair due process. When what has been happening, John, and where this really, falls apart in terms of how it happens is you have the foster care agency applying for benefits and asking to get the checks when they have to account for the money. And Social Security does require once a year that whoever's managing the money send a report back to them saying how it was used. And that report has to be sent to the legal guardian or the child, but the legal guardian is the state. So they're only notifying themselves. If you're only notifying yourself, that is not meaningful or adequate notice because the child or somebody, right, that's a closed loop that is completely obscuring any transparency or oversight. So we need fair notice when benefits are applied for, awarded, when the representative payee is chosen, and precisely on how the benefits were used. So that notice is very important. Federal law explicitly requires that any representative payee's first job is to meet regularly with the beneficiary to discuss their needs. I have yet to meet the child who had that conversation with an agency official who explained to them that they were receiving $943 a month to address their mental health needs and ask them what it is they needed. The third piece is the most important. Don't steal the kids' money. Don't take the benefits for yourself. And anybody who has a fiduciary, most of us have a bank account or savings account or retirement account of some sort. We all have fiduciaries in our lives. What's the first obligation of any fiduciary? Not to take the money for yourself. So that's a problem. So you can't take the kids' money just because you're the fiduciary. It has to be used as directed by law to meet additional needs or be conserved for their futures. The fourth piece is you actually have to meet with the child to discuss their benefits and ask them what their needs are, because at different points in their life, they might have different needs, and those will change from time to time. And I want to make sure I'm not leaving anything out. When you speak to the child, there should be a discussion about financial literacy. Do they know how much they have conserved in benefits? And how does that align with their transition plan, their transition home, their transition out of care? So we need to have a discussion. If you have an account with, let's say, $15,000, which is sort of what we think is the average here for beneficiaries in foster care, how does that align with your plans to get the housing you want or have transportation to get to school? And then the last piece of this, which actually hasn't been done by anyone yet, is to address the wrongful taking of the child's money and make them whole. So I remember a hearing, I believe it was in Minnesota, where a member of the committee during the hearing, who was a member of the GOP and a former prosecutor, said during the hearing, but what about the money that was taken? I cannot think of another criminal or civil context involving financial impropriety where the resolution did not involve making the person whole. So why are we not focused on refunding the money that was taken and used for inappropriate reasons? So the fifth ideal element of a model law is providing refunds for youth whose money was taken. And, the dozens and possibly hundreds of youth that we have spoken to in the course of this campaign have fairly consistently identified that as being the first thing that they would want to see out of this.
Oh, I would
the
imagine.
Closest we've, what was that, John?
I said, I would imagine.
Right.
If you're, it's already happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are two states that have introduced bills to provide retroactive refunds for youth: Oregon, which had its second attempt at that this year, and Minnesota. Other than that, we haven't actually seen that happen. We have seen, in some cases, lower courts order the agency to reimburse the child's funds in individual cases, but not on any sort of grand scale. So, those are the model elements of a good bill. You have to screen and apply for benefits. You have to provide appropriate notification along the way. You can't take the money for yourself. You have to use it in the way that it's intended to benefit the child on an individual basis. You should meet with the child to find out what their needs are and make sure they're prepared to use the money. And if their money was taken and spent in a way that's not consistent with the intended purpose, they should be refunded for their benefits.
And I interrupted you before, but I think you were about to say that Arizona is one such state that passed a pretty robust law. Were there others?
Correct. So the states that now have stopped, that have adopted model statutes which require application, screening, notice, conserving the child's money, and some degree of interaction to discuss like financial literacy or something of the sort. We hope they'll keep track of the data as well, so we know how many kids are actually going to get their funds now. Those include, blue places like Washington, D.C., and red states like Kansas, whose governor signed an executive order after the legislature passed a unanimous bill to end the practice. There are purple states like Arizona who have passed model legislation. We've also seen Massachusetts voluntarily end the practice even prior to their bill actually passing, which is admirable. They actually stopped their practice at the beginning of 2024, if I have that right. And then newcomers, New Mexico just adopted a very comprehensive statute. And as I mentioned, Oregon has fixed all of the elements, but they still they have a couple of technical fixes. But basically, those six entities: Kansas, New Mexico, Arizona, DC, Massachusetts, and Oregon, have all adopted either model or almost model statutes.
Yeah. And, in describing sort of the ideal legislation, all of that obviously is important. It really does feel critical that it begins with that memorialization of this practice in general, right? That started as this revenue enhancement process that is problematic. But, just taking the most cynical view of how government operates, if you take away the financial ability of them to capture this to like a general fund or just cover their costs, one might say, well, if they can't do that, they probably won't even bother to look. And so it seems very critical that they would, by law, still be required to do that now on behalf of the kids' best interest.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think the states realize that if they stopped doing this, they would be entering a different realm of legal trouble to stop a practice that's been institutionalized and done for so long. The fears that would happen really haven't panned out. But I think what's really important to remember, and I think that one of the most brilliant early moves in this campaign was done fairly modestly and under the radar by David Hansel when he was the commissioner of ACS, the child welfare system in New York City, who on his last day in office issued a directive saying, "We acknowledge that we've been doing this and that it's wrong and that it's bad for kids. We will now be transitioning from a revenue maximization framework of our system to a child-centered framework for our system. And in light of that, we will no longer be taking kids' benefits." So if you asked me how things are going in New York City now, I won't have a very rosy report to give you, but I will say that very intentional language used by David Hansel when he released that letter was very important to address what you're saying, John, because this came about as this revenue maximization strategy we're not really there anymore. I think a lot of places have recognized that was never the correct framework, and that's for a service industry that is intended to support families and children in crisis. Revenue maximization really shouldn't be what's driving us. So I think that was a really important shift that underlies the importance and logic of continued screening and application for benefits, because states will not continue to screen and apply for benefits because they're benevolent. That's not really what's going to motivate them. They will continue to screen and apply for benefits because they are legally obligated to meet all of the needs of every child who comes into care. If that child has a disability, they are responsible for identifying it quickly and getting whatever the kid needs in place to address those needs.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
So we've talked about state legislation, to some extent, some state court action here. But what we're talking about is a federal benefit. Social Security is a federally run program. Accurate to say that the investigative series that NPR Marshall Project did probably led to some words from the Biden administration. I think they acknowledged the issue, both out of the Child Welfare Division at HHS, Health and Human Services, and also from the Social Security Administration, but really no action. Is that fair to say? There was not federal action taken during those 4 years, either by the administration or by Congress on this issue.
There were some small ceremonial changes and words and actions that were taken by both agencies. SSA really tried to address this in the last year of the last administration. And, former Commissioner Martin O'Malley, I believe, was truly committed to trying to end this and ran up against some of the agency and bureaucratic problems that happen in these agencies, and did not do as much as I think he would have liked to have. There was very little action at ACF, which was extremely disappointing over the last 4 years, because I think it's important to remember that the first federal bill to end this bad practice was introduced in 2007. And it was co-sponsored by the former Secretary of HHS, Javier Becerra. Secretary Becerra was very aware of this issue. His staff at the time, who ended up serving as an assistant secretary at the agency as well, was also very aware of this issue. And I identified, along with some former foster youth and academics and others, exactly what ACF could and was authorized to do under existing law. And it wasn't done. And that was really profoundly disappointing.
What were those things? What do you think that the child welfare side of executive branch and what Social Security Administration can and should do without even a law being passed, right? What could they do tomorrow, in your opinion?
There are a lot of things. I actually have a whole menu for them that they can choose off of. But really, to be simple about it, if ACF put out a memorandum that explained that agencies may not violate their fiduciary responsibilities when they serve as representative payee by taking the child's money to offset the the cost of foster care. That would be helpful. If ACF provided some guidance to explain what it means to make decisions that are in that child's individual best interest and are not blanket policies, I think that would be helpful for states to understand what that looks like. You know, 3 disabled children are not all the same. You might have an infant that has developmental delays compared with a 12-year-old who's medically fragile and eating through a G tube, and a 17-year-old with serious mental health issues that are actually being addressed very well on medication. These children don't need the same things. They're not similarly situated. And federal law requires that each case be addressed on an individual basis to see how those benefits would serve that child's needs. So, and states, even though SSA did issue additional rules last year clarifying the prohibition on double dipping, that states can't use a child's benefits to pay for the state match. That's not a state match, that's avoiding a state match. And that they have to explain how they're using the money individually and not using blanket policies, which are still in effect in a number of states, John. So ACF can explain this is not legal. This is not, and this is a huge liability, right? You can't violate your fiduciary responsibilities without consequence. We've seen litigation. I will tell you conclusively, we will continue to see a growing amount of litigation on this issue. So from SSA's perspective, I mean, SSA is issuing checks. They are supposed to be verifying that representative payees are following the requirements and doing the things they require, like not taking the money for themselves, like using the money for individual best interest of the child. SSA is responsible for making sure that we can identify somebody who cares about this child to serve as the representative payee. They're not doing those things. They are not enforcing their own rules internally that try to provide the transparency and accountability that we need here. It would seem that because this is agency to agency, that we haven't had the transparency we need to hold the agencies accountable. They tried to create, Congress attempted to create greater transparency in 2018 when they passed the Strengthening Protections for Social Security Beneficiaries Act, which required data sharing between ACF and SSA. But we didn't get the data even then. The GAO found 3 years later that only a dozen or so states were really complying with the data sharing agreements. And, bipartisan members of Ways and Means said, we're concerned that it would appear that agencies are prioritizing their own financial bottom line over the children whose names are on the checks. And there has been, consistent bipartisan interest and concern about this over time. And that is as it should be.
So let's end on this then, because as you say, there is bipartisan interest in addressing this. You have a Republican in the White House, you have Republican-controlled Senate and House, and as you pointed out to me, which I had not seen before, the American First Policy Institute, which is very closely connected to President Trump, drafted a model executive order, presumably for him, on this topic. So do you feel, given those things, that this actually might be a ripe time for action on this? I mean, do you feel like this is something we will see federal action taken on in this next,
Yeah, well, if I pretended to know what was going to happen, then, I wouldn't be totally honest. But I do truly believe that we are looking at the end of this bad policy. And we've gotten there really in a beautiful way. This campaign has produced such incredibly inspiring and informative information in terms of how, as a community, we can interface with and collaborate with people across the spectrum who we might not agree with on any other issues or on most other issues. And when we can come together on something that helps us move something concrete and helpful forward for a group of vulnerable children, let's do it and then find the next thing that we can work together on. And it's not easy and it's complicated, but it's important and it's the right thing to do. What I've seen evolve during all of these state hearings, and I've testified in dozens of them over the last few years, is I have seen GOP senators and representatives and assembly members say, but this looks like waste, fraud, and abuse of federal taxpayer dollars. We have bad governance occurring here. We have money being taken and spent that was intended for one thing and is being used for another thing. And nobody's paying attention. And we're not going to let that slide anymore. All of which is true. We have seen members of the legislatures of more libertarian states like New Hampshire, New Mexico, and some others who have looked at this and said, I am not seeing how this is legal. How can a government snatch a citizen's personal property without any accountability? How is this not government overreach? How does this not represent the bloated bureaucracies that are doing things they shouldn't do and wasting taxpayers' money? That's how some of the libertarians have framed this. I've also heard a number of evangelical legislators, both in Congress and in state legislatures, who readily point to faith-based arguments about how this is wrong. You don't even really need to go into all of the legal arguments. It just, common sense shows us that this is wrong. It seems to have now become clear from the America First Policy Institute, who's published a white paper and, as you said, a model order, which is geared towards states, but very adaptable and applicable at the federal level as well. We have also seen the Federalist Society and R Street Consulting, right of center groups put out podcasts talking about how this is the time. We have reached the moment for Congress and the president to end the practice. We have also seen other groups from right of center. We have a really close relationship with the Center for the Rights of Abused Children, whose CEO, Darcy Olson, spoke on a panel at the American Enterprise Institute last week and has prioritized fixing this. And as far as I know, actually was the original author of the executive order, which is the one that the Kansas governor signed and the America First Policy Institute has adopted. Jason Smith's state of Missouri has a model bill that is just on the precipice of being passed and signed. It's already been unanimously gone through both houses. The same thing can be said in Iowa. They have had two bills introduced to try to end this, and they're going to keep going back at it. So once we can approach legislators in Congress and say, your states, Don Bacon's state of Nebraska, adopted one of the first bills to make sure kids knew about what was happening and is now considering more comprehensive legislation. So Congress is really in a much better place to attack this and is more motivated because their own state constituents are asking them to do so. I was in Congress last week with a father who adopted a special needs child in Missouri. And he made a very compelling case to Jason Smith's staff. And, we're going to be bringing that to Ways and Means and to the other committees of jurisdiction. And listen, John, there are not a lot of bipartisan issues today that are being universally supported and that could really make a concrete difference in the life of a young person. And this is one of those things.
Amy Harfeld, National Policy Director for the Children's Advocacy Institute. Thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to Amy Harfeld, National Policy Director for the Children's Advocacy Institute, for joining us today. And thank you to Listen for sponsoring this episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. We would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can get us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.